In 2015, a startling discovery was made inside of this off-limits area inside of a prominent South African hospital. Now, at the time, no one really understood what this discovery meant, and so eventually people just kind of forgot about it and moved on. Until 2 years later, when another eerily similar discovery was made inside of another prominent South African hospital in one of their off-limits areas. I can't believe this story has not gotten more press because one, it's recent, and two, the implications of these discoveries are mind-boggling. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please put coyote urine in the like button's apple juice. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On October 4th, 2017, a 61-year-old father of 6 named Tatike Katsai arrived at a hospital in Stellenbosch, which is one of the richest towns in South Africa. Tatike, who lived in the area with his family, had been dealing with some stomach issues over the last several months, and so this day he was finally going in to have abdominal surgery to hopefully alleviate those issues. So, after entering the building, Tatike was checked in, and then before long he was transferred to the operating room where surgeons got to work on him. After the surgery was over, Tatike was transferred to a recovery room in the hospital where he was scheduled to stay for at least a couple of days so the doctors and nurses could watch over him while he recovered and make sure there was no complications from the procedure. And so, on the afternoon of October 4th, Tatike just kind of lounged around inside of his recovery room. He couldn't really do anything because of the incisions on his stomach, and so he mostly just laid in his bed, he watched TV, he relaxed, he ate, and then at some point, some of his family members came into the hospital and they visited with him as well. By the end of that day, the day of his surgery, Tatike was definitely sore from the incisions, but overall, he was in good spirits, and to the medical staff, it seemed very likely that his surgery was a success. Early the next morning, at around 5:15 a.m., one of the nurses in the hospital went to Tatike's room to check on him. And when she went inside, Tatike was awake, he was alert, he seemed totally normal. And so after a brief conversation, the nurse told Tatike that she was just going to get him some fresh linens to make up his bed. And so Tatike nodded a thank you to her, and then the nurse, she turned away from Tatike, who's in his bed. She stepped out of the one door in the room into the hallway. She grabbed fresh linens off of a cart, and then she turned back around and went back into Tatike's room, except now Tatike was not in his bed. So the nurse immediately thought, okay, well then Tatike must have gone into his bathroom because the door was shut. He must be in the bathroom. And so just kind of reflexively, the nurse walked over to Tatike's now empty bed and replaced the linens. And then when she was done, she just looked at the bathroom door inside of his room, expecting Tatike to come outside any minute. But after a couple of minutes passed and Tatike had still not come out of the bathroom, the nurse decided to go over and just knock. And so she walked over, she knocked on the bathroom door and just kind of called out, hey, is everything okay in there? But there was no answer. And so the nurse eventually just tried the handle, and when she saw it was open, she called out that she was coming inside. She opened up the bathroom door, and it was empty. And so the nurse, she whipped her head around and looked back out at the room where Tatike should have been, and she saw, he's not on the bed, he's not under the bed, he's not anywhere in this room. Where could he have possibly gone? And she's thinking to herself, the only door out of this room is into the hallway, the same door that she had used to go out and get the linens. And if somehow Tatike had ran out of that door in the few seconds that her back was turned from Tatike, she certainly would have heard him or seen him. Because again, she was right outside the door and only outside of his room for a couple of seconds. Not to mention the fact, Tatike has major incisions on his stomach and could barely stand, let alone walk or run. And so totally baffled, this nurse ultimately left the room and went and told her superiors. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. In 2017, I left the military, and pretty much right away, I fell apart. The military had provided a lot of structure in my life, and so suddenly not having that structure made me feel like I was lost. Pretty soon, I began resenting all the people around me just because they seemed happy and I wasn't. I sort of figured that these feelings of resentment and unhappiness would just kind of go away on their own, but they didn't. Eventually, with some encouragement from my family and my friends, I sought out a therapist. And quickly, my therapist diagnosed me with depression, something I really did not think I was. But after the shock of the diagnosis had worn off, me and my therapist were able to kind of go back in my life and figure out what was causing me to feel the way I was feeling. And before long, having that perspective really made me feel a lot better. Look, therapy is not for everyone, but it is a great starting point for people who just kind of feel lost and don't really know where to go. And so if that's you, I would highly suggest you give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service, and it's 100% online. Get matched with a therapist after filling out a brief survey, and then you can communicate with your therapist however you feel comfortable, whether that's text messaging, phone call, video call, chat, whatever you want. You can also switch therapists at any time for free. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/MrBallen. I've also linked them in the description below. This hospital would immediately begin looking for TTK on the grounds of the hospital, but they would do it kind of quietly. They wouldn't call TTK's family to tell them that, hey, we can't find him, nor would they call police. And some have speculated that either one, the hospital did not think this was an emergency and they would quickly find TTK and that everything would be fine, or two, the hospital was just so embarrassed at the idea that they lost a patient, they didn't want anyone to know, and so that's why they didn't tell anyone. Regardless, the hospital would search for TTK all day on the 5th, the day he went missing, and they wouldn't find him. And then the next day, the 6th, the hospital again would spend the entire day quietly searching everywhere in the hospital, but they wouldn't find him again. And so finally on the next day, the 7th, so 48 hours after TTK had just kind of vanished inside of his room, the hospital would reach out to TTK's family and they would say to them, hey, is TTK home with you guys? And the family was like, no, he's supposed to be with you. And so the hospital would say, well, he left 2 days ago, so we don't know where he is. And so TTK's family is horrified, not only that they were totally left in the dark, but they would find out over the course of this conversation that the hospital had not even contacted the police yet. And so the family, they reached out to the police, and then later that day, the family would meet the police at the Stellenbosch hospital, and then a very public search of the property would ensue to look for TTK. However, again, no one could find him. Authorities would continue to search both the hospital and also the neighboring area outside of the hospital over the next couple of days, but after they continued to find absolutely nothing, the search began to wind down. And so TTK's devastated family was left with absolutely no idea what to think or what to do. Fast forward to October 20th, so 15 days after TTK had gone missing. And on this day, the 20th, there was a construction crew at this hospital in Stellenbosch doing some renovations. And at some point on this day, one of the workers had to climb into the ceiling of one of the floors of this hospital. Now, the space above the ceiling is this tight, cramped space, almost like an attic. It's very big and wide. It's like the whole length of that floor. And really the only people that would ever go into the ceiling are construction workers or other authorized personnel that needed to do work. It's not a place that the public would ever go into. But when one of these workers went up into the ceiling, he had a headlamp on and he's kind of looking around. He's looking for what he needs to do up there. And at some point he turns his head and his light illuminates a person sitting in the corner far away from him, way up against the side in this tiny little attic space. And it would turn out it was TTK and he was deceased. The hospital had absolutely no clue how TTK could have gotten up there. Not only is it obviously not a publicly accessible area, but the actual way to get up into the ceiling, the door that leads up into the ceiling, is very difficult to find. And even if TTK found this entrance into the ceiling, it would have been nearly impossible for him to actually get into the ceiling. Because again, this guy has serious incisions on his stomach from the surgery he got. He could barely barely sit up, he couldn't really walk, so the idea of him climbing and pulling himself up into the ceiling just seems impossible. Then there was the very strange autopsy results. Now, the full report has not been made public, but Tatike's family had a consultation with the hospital after the autopsy was complete, and they would go to reporters and talk about what the hospital told them. And apparently, the hospital told the family that Tatike did not die from complications from his surgery, and they heavily insinuated that Tatike did not die from natural causes. Something happened to him, and the hospital had no idea what this something was, and that's what killed him. And the hospital also told the family that Tatike likely was dead before he went up into the ceiling. Meaning someone or something killed Tatike, and then someone or something placed him in the ceiling. Again, this is just from the family going to reporters and talking about their discussion with the hospital. The hospital's only official statement has basically been that they have cooperated with the family and they don't really know what happened to Tatike. Now, of course, this is a very strange story, but it gets even weirder. On May 10th, 2019, so about a year and a half after Tatike was found deceased in the Stellenbosch hospital ceiling, a 53-year-old father of 4 named Sandile Sibiya arrived at another hospital in South Africa. It was in a city called Durban, which is considered to be one of the nicest and wealthiest places in South Africa, similar to Stellenbosch. Sandile was a builder, and he had been working on a house when he had fallen and broken his leg. Specifically, he broke his femur bone, the bone that runs from your hip down to your knee, the big single bone in your thigh. So just for reference, if you break your femur, you can't walk. So, with some assistance from friends and family, Sandile hobbled his way into this hospital in Durban, and he began to receive care. 2 days later, on May 17th, Sandile was still in the hospital, still recovering from this broken femur, when his cousin came to visit him. The cousin said Sandile seemed totally normal, and that during this visit, Sandile told the cousin that after the cousin left, Sandile was going to be transported from this hospital to another hospital nearby, where he was going to get an x-ray of his leg, as well as talk to another orthopedic surgeon. But apparently, after this cousin left from this visit, the doctors at the Durban hospital walked into Sandile's room to take him and transport him to this other hospital, and Sandile was not in his room. Now, this hospital in Durban was known for their very tight security, and so right away, their reaction was very different than the Stellenbosch hospital's reaction. This hospital immediately contacted authorities and said, "We are missing a patient," and they began a very public search of their hospital for Sandile. But they couldn't find him. On May 18th, so 6 days after Sandile disappeared, the hospital in Durban began to smell this horrible stench coming from one wing of their hospital. And so hospital workers would track the stench to a janitor's closet, and when they opened it up, they saw this black liquid dripping out of the ceiling, and the liquid was coming from Sandile's decomposing body that was located in the ceiling. Sandile's autopsy would be carried out very quickly. However, the results of that autopsy have never been made public, and Sandile's family has not commented on the results of this autopsy. As of today, all we know is that within a 2-year period, 2 seemingly ordinary South African men, who both could either not walk at all or who could barely walk because of their physical injuries, somehow snuck out of their hospital rooms totally undetected by staff and then wound up dead in the hospital ceiling. Some say the men really did somehow sneak out of their own accord and decided to go into the ceiling, and that's what happened. Others say both men were murdered and then placed into the ceiling, and still others think these 2 cases are the best examples of something called spontaneous teleportation, which is the hypothetical phenomenon where a human suddenly disappears and then almost instantaneously reappears in another location. But for now, there is no official explanation, so those are all just theories. And so it's up to you to decide what you believe. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's story and you haven't done this already, please put coyote urine in the like button's apple juice. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we upload remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it is available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity called the MrBallen Foundation. It provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Espanol. We post near daily content on Facebook, Snapchat, and TikTok. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Maritime history is full of unexplained phenomenon and tall tales of sea monsters and, mariners going out and returning in different parts of the world and not knowing how they got there. You've abandoned ships. You have all these crazy things that happen out on the ocean. And many of them are just stories. We like to believe them because they're fascinating, but few of them actually hold up and are true. But one story, it is absolutely as fascinating as some of these very tall tales, but also happens to be true. Today, I'm going to cover that story, and it is the story of the lost Hawaiian fisherman. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have 5 highly experienced Hawaiian fishermen that take off on a daytime fishing trip. The weather turns really bad while they're out in the water and they don't return. Despite an extensive search effort, they are not located, and after a year, the families and friends of the lost fishermen, they host a memorial service and assume that their loved ones are gone forever. 9 years later, they make a discovery on a very small island 2,300 miles away that calls into question the entire story. It's an amazing story, it's a tragic story, but it's one worth listening to right to the very end. Before we get started, if you are into strange and mysterious stories like the one I've just described, my channel is going to be a bevy of content just like that. And so if you could gently liquidate, if you could gently liquidate, I can't even say it. If you could gently liquidate the like button, if you could gently liquidate the like button and subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. Scott Moorman was born in 1952 in the San Fernando Valley in California. At a young age, he loved the show Adventures in Paradise, which was about this crew of young sailors that would travel the South Pacific looking for adventure and passengers to pick up along the way. And it was just this brilliant show to him. And he became obsessed with living in the South Pacific when he got older. Specifically, he wanted to live in Hawaii. But that wouldn't necessarily happen right away because at a young age, he got married and had a son and stayed in California. But in 1975, he and his wife split up. And so he took that as an opportunity to go fulfill that childhood dream of living in Hawaii. And so he, on his own, his son stayed with his former wife. He, Scott, moves out to the east coast of Maui on Hawaii. And he moves into this little town called Nahiku. Now, Nahiku was full of lots of native Hawaiians and a growing population of kind of like refugees in a way, Vietnam veterans kind of that were over living in the mainland. You have hippies and kind of earth-loving people that do a lot more partying than working. They were all kind of congregating in this same town. And Scott, he loved that culture and he quickly became a part of it. But he also, unlike a lot of the kind of hippies that made their way to Nahiku, that were part of that growing population, Scott really wanted to kind of become a part of the whole culture of Nahiku, because he growing up, he loved Hawaii. He didn't want to be the others on the island. He wanted to be a part of the main culture. And so he took it upon himself to learn the sort of pidgin English that locals would use. He took time to learn some of the cultural traditions that they had, and really went out of his way to try to befriend some of the locals. And while he wasn't really embraced as, a kind of local, he did form a number of friendships with local Hawaiians, and in time, he really felt like this is where he belongs. This was home to him 100%. So he would only go back to California one time. He goes back once for his son's birthday, and he also sees his parents while he's there, and they are all pleading with him to come back, be with your family. They want him to stay. And he says, no, Nahiku is where I belong, and I can't envision myself living anywhere else. And so when he flies back after that one visit to California for his son's birthday, when he flies back to Nahiku, that would be the last time that his son, his former wife, and his parents, his family, back in the mainland would see him. That's the last they would see him. On February 11th, 1979, Scott and 4 of his friends decide that they're not going to go to work that day. They all worked construction together. Instead, they're going to go fishing because they all love to fish and the weather was beautiful, so they said, why not? Now, none of them owned their own boat, so they had to ask a friend who had a 17-foot Boston whaler named the Sarah Joe. Their friend allowed them to use it, and so they got their boat, they went to the store, got some beer, snacks, and got some ice for their big ice chest so they could pack it with the fish they caught, that they hopefully caught, and they were on their way. The part of Hawaii that Scott and his friends lived in, the east coast of Maui, at the time did not get any TV stations, and radio broadcasts were done maybe once a week and were hard to pick up. So people in that area, especially fishermen and anybody that was out on the water, they were accustomed to going out without a weather report. They basically played the weather by their eye. They kind of just sized it up and said, does it seem okay? Okay, it seems good, and they would go out. Obviously that's pretty risky, but the locals were pretty good at it, and Scott and his buddies also were very good at this point at kind of reading the weather, and so they thought this day was going to be just fine. Now, in order to get to the place where they intended to fish, they would need to pass through something called the Alanui-Haha Channel, which is considered to be one of the roughest and most dangerous areas for all sailors anywhere near Hawaii. So it's a dangerous place. It's at certain points, it is almost 7,000 feet deep. There's very strong surface currents. It's just a risky place to be if, for example, there was a big storm. Now, when Scott and the Sarah Joe crew took off, the water was calm, the weather was beautiful, and by about 10 a.m., when they believed they must have been in the channel at this point, the weather was still very calm. However, a low pressure system had picked up very suddenly between 10 and noon. And so when they probably were somewhere towards the end of the channel, when they were going to be making their way into open water to fish, there was beginning to be torrential downpour all along the channel. And it eventually turned into a full scale hurricane. So on the island, people described this particular storm as being one of the worst they've seen in 50 plus years. This is like a sudden, freak, horrible storm. Of the boats that took off to go fishing out of this East Coast section of Maui, there was 4 fishing boats that went out. 3 returned. The one that didn't was, of course, the Sarah Joe. At 5 p.m., the Coast Guard is notified by their friends and family that they have not returned yet. The storm is still raging, gale force winds, torrential downpour, but they still send out a plane to look overhead. A number of crews were sent out to go look for them, even with the incredible risk of searching in this weather. But considering the dangers they were in, they decided it was necessary. The searchers who were in the boats, the boat crews that were sent out to look for the Sarah Joe crew, they said that at best they could see maybe 50 feet in front of them, and even that was a stretch. So it was a limited search, but they did go out on the day of the storm. Over the next 5 days, the Coast Guard led a search that included 44 planes and boats covering a 56,000 square mile search block for the Sarah Joe, but nothing was found. There was absolutely no trace of them, and so after 5 days, unfortunately, the Coast Guard called off the search. However, the people in their hometown in Nahiku They knew these 5 men. These were incredibly capable, very experienced fishermen. They were all great swimmers. They believed that because they hadn't found a trace of them, that perhaps they were still alive out there. And so they, as a community, raised $50,000 to pay private ships and planes to continue the search. So there was an extended search that went on for a couple more weeks that covered an even bigger swath of territory, but at the end still yielded no results. The people that were doing the searching were just baffled, because when people go missing at sea, there's some indication a lot of times when they're just fishing basically right off the coast, there's some indication of what happened to them. It's rare that you would have 0% found. Absolutely no idea what happened to these 5 fishermen. 1 year after their disappearance, the families and friends decide to host a memorial and mourn the loss officially for their loved ones. It was believed at this point that they had all perished. 2,300 miles southwest of the Hawaiian Islands lies this tiny little stretch of, I guess you can call them islands, called the Taongi Atoll. And these little tiny strips of land that were barely higher than sea level barely sustained any life. There was a couple scrub plants that took hold here and there, but there's no fresh water. The only recorded human life that's ever been there was during World War II. A number of Japanese soldiers were stranded there briefly, but it is 200 miles from the nearest inhabited land. It's very far from any major shipping lane. It's just a place that, as a human being, you don't want to go. In fact, it was actually considered, when they were testing the atomic bomb, when the United States was, it was considered to be a great spot to test the atomic bomb because no one's there and no one's anywhere near it. So incredibly isolated. On September 10th, 1988, marine biologist John Naughton, along with 4 other crew members, descended upon the Taongi Atoll. They were sent there by the Marshall Islands to find a suitable wildlife sanctuary for some sea turtles and seabirds. Within 30 minutes of arriving at the atoll, John and his crew saw what looked like a skeleton of a boat, a Boston whaler boat that was down on the shore. John was actually a resident of Maui, so he's from Hawaii, and he saw on the back of this kind of skeletal remains of this boat the letters HA, which means it's registered in Hawaii. And so he's intrigued because we're 2,300 miles from Hawaii, and he starts moving the sand away to get a better look to see if there's any more writing on the boat. And he makes out a couple of letters, an S, an R, an H, an O, an E, and he puts it together. He's like, this is the Sarah Joe. This is the boat that went missing 9 years earlier. And the reason he knew it that quickly is because he was one of the people deeply involved in the search efforts to find these lost fishermen. He was like leading search groups. He was totally committed to finding them. And here he is in a crazy twist of fate, 2,300 miles away, almost a decade later, finding the boat. Now, the boat did not initially provide any sort of information about where the fishermen might be. There was nothing on it. It was just the wood, very degraded from water, wear and tear. But the crew decided that they would search the island and just kind of look around, because perhaps the crew, even if it was years and years ago, maybe they landed here and then they ultimately perished once they were here. So maybe we can find their remains or just some sign that they might have been here. John walks about 100 yards away from the Sarah Joe, and he sees what looks like kind of a crudely constructed cross out of driftwood. And below it, he can see that there's a bunch of rocks that have been placed definitely in some sort of decorative way, and it looks like a gravesite. And considering what they're looking for, he thinks there's the first of the bodies that we're going to find. He calls over his crew, and so they begin kind of moving some things aside. They don't want to totally disturb the grave, just to be respectful. But a little ways down, the inside of the grave is not only bones, but they find this little book. The book had no writing in it, and it's hard to even call it a book. It was more like a stack of papers. But on each page, there was a little square cutout of tinfoil that sat on the page. Basically, every page had a little square of tinfoil and nothing else to it. No one knew what it meant, but undoubtedly, somebody had very clearly buried somebody else right here in a very shallow grave and had left this little book in here with whoever was buried here. And so while John and a couple of his crew are looking at this book and trying to make sense of it, one of his crew members that was just kind of standing back looking at the site commented that, the bones that are in that grave, they're not very bleached. Now, if a bone's been sitting for a long time, it will basically bleach and become totally white. Everything comes off the bone. These bones looked relatively fresh. So whoever was buried here, they had been buried recently. At this point, John and his crew have basically abandoned their kind of wildlife sanctuary research, and now they're just scouring this little scrub of land in the Taongi Atoll for any other signs of, things that could have to do with the Sarah Jo crew, and they found nothing else. So they report back to the Coast Guard and alert the Marshallese authorities that what was found on the island, and they send out a couple of forensic experts to examine the bone. They were able to determine that the bones in the grave belonged to Scott Moorman. When news got back to the Hawaiian mainland that Scott Moorman had been found, the family members of the other 4 fishermen that went missing on the Sarah Jo, they hired private detectives to go scour the Taongi Atoll, look everywhere, see if you can find our loved ones' remains. And so this team of private detectives and a dive team and all these people are sent to the Taongi Atoll, and they look everywhere. They're digging up the sand. They have dive teams going out into the water. I mean, they are really leaving no stone unturned. And all they're able to find is the outboard motor of the Sarah Jo, which was a little ways off the coast from where the boat itself was found, wedged in some coral. And then they also found a handful of more bones on the beach near where that shallow grave where Scott Moorman was buried. But those bones also belong to Scott Moorman. So there was nothing else found of the other 4 fishermen or any indication of what happened to the boat. There's nothing. And in fact, researchers that were able to look at the bones of Scott Moorman, there wasn't enough evidence there to help them determine a cause of death. So we don't even know how he passed away or when he passed away. However, it was determined just based on the bleaching of the bones that it was a relatively recent death. I don't know what the timeline is on that, but recent is the term that's used. While it was a very big deal that they located Scott Moorman's remains on the Taongi Atoll, even though it was 10 years later, this is revelatory. This is a really big deal, not only for the families of the fishermen, but for anybody involved. This is a really big deal. But there was an additional revelation once Scott Moorman's bones were found that basically turned this case upside down. There's already a bunch of questions like, who buried Scott Moorman? How did Scott Moorman become freshly buried almost a decade later? How long had they been there? There's some basic questions that you're going to ask. But there's one fact that nobody seems to be able to reconcile. And that was 6 years after they went missing, the Marshall Islands conducted a government survey of the Taongi Atoll, which would mean they scoured the islands, all those little strips of land that make up the Taongi Atoll. They scoured it, just taking measurements and basically mapping out the Taongi Atoll. I think it was in preparation for potentially turning it into this wildlife sanctuary. So they looked everywhere on the Taongi Atoll 6 years after the Sarah Jo went missing. So they go missing. 6 years later, there's this government survey of the Taongi Atoll. And guess what? They ended up looking at that survey, and there's no boat, there's no shallow grave, there's nothing. It's just an uninhabited strip of land, nothing else. There's no boats there. Experts, when this was revealed, said that, well, had they, the Sarah Jo, the crew of the Sarah Jo, gone dead in the water following the storm, they could have drifted the 2,300 miles to the Taongi Atoll in roughly 3 months. But they weren't there at the 6-year mark. So what were they doing between the disappearance and the 6-year mark, which would have been the earliest they could have arrived, because prior to, they would have been discovered during this audit. So you have a 6-year gap where no one can account for where they were. Even if they made it to the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day after they had disappeared, that they had been somehow surviving in the open ocean for 6 years, and they just so happened to land at the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day later. Basically, they just after the survey's done, let's say they make it there. Who buried Scott Moorman? And what was the booklet that was buried with him with the tinfoil squares? This is a totally uninhabited stretch of land. There is no one there to perform any sort of burial ritual. Even if we're willing to say that maybe one of the other fishermen buried Scott Moorman, well, then where are the other fishermen? Some people wonder, are they still alive? So like many of my videos, unfortunately, there isn't really a good conclusion here. It just kind of ends in a bunch of questions. But I would love it if you included in the comments section what you think could be the reason behind that 6-year gap. How can we account for those 6 years when they were not at the Taongi Atoll? I mean, my suggestion would be maybe the survey wasn't done very well and they just missed it. But that still doesn't also answer, well, who buried Scott Moorman? And also, why were his bones not so bleached? How did he come to be freshly buried 9.5 years after he disappeared? So lots of questions. I would love to hear your theories, your comments, your takeaways in the comments section. And again, if you liked this video, please hit like, please click subscribe, turn on all notifications, because I'm gonna be posting stories like this one 3-4 times a week. I love doing this and I hope you'll come along. If you want to follow me on other social media channels, my handle on Instagram is JohnBallen416, and I am MrBallen, one word, on every other social media platform. I post quite a bit on TikTok, so you can check me out over there. That's going to do it, guys. I hope that was interesting, and I look forward to reading your comments. See ya. Hey everybody, real quick, I don't normally make announcements at the beginning of stories, but today is different because I have a massive announcement. Starting right now, today, the MrBallen podcast that rose immediately to the top of the charts when we launched it in 2022 and then was scooped up by Amazon by the end of the year. Yeah, that show is now available on all podcast platforms and it is free. Now, don't worry if you've been listening to this podcast on Amazon Music. That's awesome. You can keep doing that because with your Prime membership, you will get MrBallen podcast episodes 1 month earlier than everybody else, and it will be ad-free. But again, the show is on every other platform right now, and it really is free. So go ahead and follow the MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories on Amazon Music or wherever else you get your podcasts. Today's story is about one of the most famous, potentially paranormal events of all time, except almost no Westerners have heard of it because it happened in China. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please put the like button stapler in Jello. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late on the evening of July 27th, 1977, a 21-year-old farmer named Huang Yanqiu walked down a wide, dusty road in the little farming village of Beigao, located in northern China. It had been a very hard day on the rice farm where Huang worked because they were all preparing for the autumn harvest. But even though Huang was totally exhausted and worn down, as he walked down this road, he was whistling an upbeat tune. Because for the first time in a long time, Huang was actually excited about the future. Huang had grown up in a poor family and he hadn't even finished elementary school. He still lived with his parents in a tiny house, and basically every day of his life was the same. He got up at sunrise, he walked to work, he worked all day until he barely could even stand, and then he would walk home and he would go to bed. But the reason Huang was now feeling kind of excited about his future was because he had just gotten engaged to a beautiful girl in a neighboring village, and their plan was to get married after the autumn harvest. Huang was already hard at work, literally building them a house that they could move into after they got married. And in fact, on this particular night, that was where Huang was going. He was going to the property where he was in the middle of building this house, and he was going there not to work on the house anymore, but really just to admire his property, because again, he was just so excited about the future. Huang turned the corner and his beautiful half-constructed home came into focus. The foundation, the walls, and the ceiling were all complete. All he had left to do was put in the windows and the doors. And so Huang walked up and ran his hand over the beautiful brick he'd laid around the outside of the property. Brick was not cheap. He had worked extra hours to afford this brick. And so he was just so proud of it. And he ran his hand over it. And then he kind of stepped back and kind of imagined the house when it was all done. And then when he felt satisfied that he had seen enough, he just kind of nodded and turned and just continued walking back towards his home, his parents' home, which was only a few minutes away. When Huang got to his home, he went inside, and his mom already had a meal made for him. It was just some rice and veggies. And so Huang sat down and began eating, and then his parents came over, and they began chatting. And then, of course, the conversation shifted to Huang's upcoming marriage, because that's basically all Huang ever wanted to talk about. And then by about 10 p.m., Huang was so tired that he crawled into his bed, and he fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, when Huang's parents woke up, they discovered that Huang was not in his bed. Now, this was not totally unusual because they knew their son was a really hard worker, and it wasn't unusual for him to wake up really, really early to head out to the farm to begin his workday. But a little while later, the workers at the rice farm where Huang worked, they saw Huang had not come to work, and because that was so out of character for him, one of the workers actually walked to Huang's parents' home to see if he was okay. And when Huang's mother found out her son had not shown up to work, she was really worried, but she told this worker, my son must have gone to the house he's building, go over there and see if he's there. But the worker from the rice farm went to Huang's property he was building, and nobody was there. And so when he came back and told Huang's mother, this sent her into a total panic, because really for her, this was like completely out of character for her son. He would never miss work. He would never just disappear like this. Something was wrong. So Huang's mother sent this rice farm worker to go find her husband and tell him what was going on with Huang. And then in the meantime, Huang's mother just walked outside and began going door to door, asking neighbors if they knew where her son was and if they wouldn't mind coming out and helping her look. Now, at this time, the village of Beigao was a relatively small place where all the residents more or less knew each other. And so it did not take long for the news of Huang being missing to spread all across Beigao, and the community really came out in force to go look for him. And so by the afternoon, there were people on bikes riding all around, calling out for Huang. People were going to neighboring villages to see if he was there. Another group of villagers went to Huang's fiance's home, and they spoke to her, and she had no idea where Huang was. And so by about the early afternoon, when so many people couldn't find any leads to where Huang had gone, it became clear that really nobody had a clue what happened to him. Now, Beigao at the time was incredibly isolated. This is a small town where most of the people who live there don't have phones, they don't have cars, they ride their bikes everywhere, and there were no roads that connected Beigao to any other place. Now, there was a paved road that went through Beigao, but it actually just came to an end on the outskirts of Beigao. So there was just no way to go to other places, at least not efficiently. Basically, if you lived in Beigao at the time, there was a finite number of places you could go. And all these people that had gone out looking for Huang had searched all of those places, and Huang just was not there. And they discovered his bike was still leaning up against his parents' house, and his work clothes, which he wore basically every single day, were still folded up neatly inside of his room. And so wherever Huang was, he was on foot, and he was still in his pajamas. That night, Huang's parents would contact the village committee, which was basically like the governing body for Beigao, and the village committee decided that this was serious enough, because again, they're thinking, this is impossible, where is this guy? That they decided to contact the police. But when the police got this call, they did not launch an investigation right away because they had limited resources and there was no sign of foul play here. It was very weird that Huang was missing, but he was an adult, and if he wanted to go vanish somewhere, it was kind of like, okay, you're an adult, you can do that. And so Huang's family and the rest of the Beigao villagers were forced to just kind of wait and see if Huang came back. But over the next few days, Huang did not come back, and there was still no new information about what might have happened to him. Early on the morning of August 5th, so 8 days after Huang went missing, and still by this point there's no sign of him, the deputy director of the Beigao Village Committee came running up the road to Huang's parents' house and knocked on the door. When the door opened up, it was Huang's father, and the deputy director handed him a telegram he had just gotten and said, "Read it." And so Huang's father took the telegram and began reading it, and as he did, his eyes went wide, and then when he was done, he looked up and he was just so confused.
Last weekend, I asked old Sego,
What he wanted to snack on for our Super Bowl 58 watch party.
and he said without hesitation, "Papa, voglio mangiare vari molluschi esotici," which of course in Italian means, "Papa, I just want to eat various exotic mollusks." And so I said, "That's just bully." And immediately I booked us a trip to Alaska, we hopped on a fishing boat, and off we went to snatch up a few of those slippery beasts. But unfortunately, about 15 hours into our seafaring voyage, Lung and I realized we had a problem. Our boat captain was not a boat captain. He was just a simple, blind kangaroo with vertigo who happened to jump on board before we left, and we just didn't notice. We tried to take the wheel from the roo, but he was so strong that he drove us directly into a storm, and before long a rogue wave came and capsized the vessel. But luckily me and old Sika Lung, we lived, and we swam to a nearby island. And when we stepped foot on land, immediately a horde of angry coconut crabs came out of the brush, skittering around, wielding their machetes. Me and old Lung turned to run. But there was nowhere to go, it was just the ocean. And so standing there, waiting for death, me and Lung did the only thing we could think to do. We signed up for DraftKings. Now, did that save us from the machete-wielding coconut crabs? No! But did it get us jacked up about Super Bowl 58? Wow! Yes, it did. And so once again, this year, we are partnering up with DraftKings to make sure all you fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious out there get access to the very best deals on their platform. And for Super Bowl 58, they got a really good deal. For all customers, there is a bet one, get one, which means you get a bonus bet back to you in the amount of your original wager just for placing a bet. Pretty good. And there are loads of other amazing opportunities for Super Bowl 58 on DraftKings, so go check it out now. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app right now. New customers use promo code MrBallen, bet $5 on any wager, and you'll receive $200 in bonus bets instantly. Again, that's promo code MrBallen, only at DraftKings Sportsbook. The telegram had been sent 8 days earlier at around 9 a.m. on July 28th. So basically right around the time that Huang's family discovered Huang was missing was when this telegram was sent. But for whatever reason, the telegram had been very delayed, and so they were just receiving this telegram now, 8 days later. And the contents of this telegram made no sense. It said that just 9 hours after Huang had fallen asleep in his parents' home, he was discovered lying on the sidewalk in the middle of this bustling city called Nanjing, located 600 miles to the south of Beigao. Now, the reason Huang's father and the deputy director were so confused by this telegram was this was impossible. Remember, Huan does not have a car, so the only way he could get around was on foot or on his bike, and we know he left his bike by his house, so he's on foot and very likely in his pajamas, and what, he's gonna go 600 miles? I mean, even if he walked the 30 miles to the nearest train station, 9 hours, because that's how much time it took from falling asleep to being discovered in the city, is not enough time to go the remaining 570 miles to Nanjing. So Huang's father and the deputy director, they talked about this, and they both decided that, this just can't be true. Clearly, somebody has mistaken some other person for Huang, because he cannot possibly be all the way in Nanjing. Now, this telegram said that Huang was being held in a deportation center in Shanghai, and so Huang's father and the deputy director decided they would send a telegram back to the sender at this deportation center and tell them, hey, if this really is Huang, he should have a very specific birthmark on his wrist. And so when they sent this telegram off, they fully expected to get one back that said, oh, our mistake, it wasn't him. But they got a reply relatively quickly, and it said, oh yeah, he's got that exact birthmark. It's definitely Huang, but he's very confused. He doesn't really know what's going on. And so somebody from your village has to go get him.
Huang arrived back home in the middle of August, so about 2 weeks after he had gone missing. And as soon as he got there, his fiance and his parents were so happy to see him. And pretty soon, a steady stream of friends and neighbors and other family members began coming to Huang's house to talk to him, to hear his story, to hear about what happened. But Huang really didn't understand what had happened to him. And so mostly he just didn't answer any questions he got asked. He just kind of kept his head down and just kept saying, I don't know what happened. And then really when his family pressed him and said, you gotta tell us, this is so crazy, what happened? He would say, look, I'm gonna tell you what happened, but I don't even know if I can believe the things I'm gonna tell you. And so Huang would say, all he could remember was he went to bed in his own bed in Beigao. And then the next morning he woke up and he was laying on the sidewalk. And when he opened his eyes, he saw there was this big swimming pool, and then near it was a sign that said Nanjing. And so that was how he put together that he was in Nanjing. And then almost immediately, these two police officers wearing all white just kind of appeared out of nowhere, and they walked up to Huang, they scooped him up, and without really saying anything to him, they brought him to that deportation center in Shanghai, which is a place where people who seem confused or mentally ill would be sent in order to help them get home. And that was it. That was Huang's entire story, that he just basically woke up in Nanjing with no idea how he got there. And so after he told his family, they all just kind of looked at him like, really? That's what happened? That makes no sense. But Huang, he was completely lucid. He was explaining it really specifically and really simply. He looked and sounded exactly like he normally did, and he seemed very honest as he was telling the story. Over the next few weeks, Huang kind of reintegrated back into his life, but things just were not the same. People were now scared of him. Kids literally ran away from him when they saw him because rumors were going around town that he himself, his body, was haunted or something. And so kids were scared of him, and other villagers would openly gossip about him right in front of him. Even his beloved fiance admitted to feeling really uncomfortable around him now. And while all of this was obviously very upsetting for Huang, he did also understand why people were acting this way. This is a very anomalous thing that's happened to him, and he did not have a good explanation for this totally insane event that he was a part of. And so he just kind of got it. And in fact, Huang himself was kind of terrified of himself. At night when he would go to bed, he would be terrified that the second he closed his eyes, he was going to be transported hundreds or thousands of miles away to some totally unknown place, and maybe this time he wouldn't even be able to get back again. But as the days wore on, Huang continued to wake up in his own bed in Beigao, which over time kind of made him feel more secure that whatever happened to him was a one-time thing and it's not going to happen again. However, Huang would be wrong. On September 8th, 1977, so 3 weeks after Huang had returned back home, he went to sleep in his bed in the village of Beigao, but when he woke up the next morning, he was not there. The first thing Huang noticed when he woke up that morning were the sounds around him were totally different. They were not right. Normally, when he was asleep in his home, he would hear the sound of his mother and father snoring right by him, and he might hear some insects or birds out his window. And those sounds were gone. Instead, he heard what sounded like footsteps, but not ordinary footsteps. They were footsteps of somebody walking on cement who was wearing high heels, like a clicking sound. And then Huang also became aware of the fact that his face was clearly pressed up against cement. He was laying on the ground. But Huang couldn't open his eyes. As hard as he tried, he couldn't do it. He couldn't move his body. And so he's just laying there on cement with his eyes closed, listening to the sound of these footsteps, these high heels, getting closer and closer and closer. And as they did, his anxiety was growing and growing. He had no idea who this person was. And then these footsteps, they got right up to him and then passed by him. And Huang felt the breeze as this person walked right past him. And then after this person in high heels had kind of walked off in the other direction, Huang finally was able to wrench open his eyes, and he sat up and he looked around, and one, he couldn't find anybody. It was totally abandoned all around him. So whoever had those high heels on had somehow vanished in plain sight. And then also, as Huang continued to look around him, it looked like he was in the middle of this city. But again, there's nobody out there. It's like this abandoned city street. All he had in front of him was this clock up on a building that said 1 a.m. And so pretty soon, Huang was just kind of walking in circles, screaming out for help. And right when he was about to just start sprinting in any one direction in hope that help would be somewhere out there, Huang felt a tap on his shoulder. And then the person tapping him from behind him said, "Are you Huang Yancho?" Huang spun around and he saw there were these two men in military uniforms standing there. And for a second, Huang felt relieved. Somebody was here to help him. But then he thought to himself, how do they know my name? What's going on here? And so he asked them, how do you know my name? But the two men didn't answer Huang. Instead, they told him that he was at a Shanghai railway station 700 miles from Beigao, and that they, these two soldiers, were here to take Huang to a nearby army base. At this point, Huang was so scared, he just didn't know what to do. So he just wound up going with these two soldiers who put him in the back of a Jeep. And then they hopped in and began driving, and they drove him out of this weird abandoned city where he had woken up. And after driving for some time, they arrived at this huge army base that had all these rows of fencing around it with razor wire on top and all these sentries that guarded all the doors. And these two soldiers brought him through several of these checkpoints. And then when they reached the very last one, they stopped the car, they got out, Huang got out too, and the two soldiers that were with him grabbed Huang's shoulders, and they basically led him through the last checkpoint, which was manned by armed guards. And as Huang was led through this gate, the armed guards seemed to not even notice the soldiers or Huang. It was like they were invisible to the armed guards. But either way, they got through the final checkpoint, and then the two soldiers that were carrying Huang led him to this kind of nondescript big building, and they opened up a door, and they began walking down this long hallway that kind of zigged and zagged. It was like a maze of different directions you could go. And then finally they brought Huang right to this big door that said division headquarters over it. And then before Huang could say anything, one of the two soldiers that was with him knocked on the door. And then before anybody could respond, that same soldier reached down, opened it up, swung the door in, and then they pushed Huang inside, and they stepped in after him and shut the door behind them. In front of Huang was this big desk, and sitting behind this desk was a very senior-looking military official wearing a uniform. And this official, when they looked up and saw Huang standing there, they got up to their feet and put their hands on their gun and said, "What are you doing here? How'd you get in here?" And Huang, sensing there was something wrong, threw his hands up to show he was not a threat and pointed behind him and said, "They brought me here." And the military official, who still had his hand on his gun, looked behind Huang and said, "Who brought you here?" And Huang, he turned around and he saw the two soldiers who had picked him up and driven him here and led him to this room. They were gone, which was impossible because Huang would have heard them leave. He didn't hear anything. The door never opened. They just somehow were gone. A second later, the senior military official had pulled out his radio and he was screaming commands. And then another second later, armed soldiers came running into the room. They grabbed Huang, who still had his hands up. They came in, they arrested Huang, and they began asking him all these questions about how he got in here. How did you get through the guards? Did you climb the fence? Did you cut the fence? How did you get in here? It's not possible that you are here right now. But Huang did not have any answers. All he could say was, "The two soldiers, they brought me here." A couple of days later, Huang would be bussed back to Beigao, and again, his friends and family and everybody in town had all these questions about what happened, but again, Huang just had no answers. And then just 11 days after coming back home the second time, Huang would disappear again. And this time he would tell people he encountered two men who told him they were the same two men from the other two times he had gone missing. You had the first instance where he woke up and two police officers in white picked him up off the ground and brought him to the deportation center. And then the second time was the military base where you had those two soldiers who brought him through the gates and brought him to division headquarters. Basically, these two men he encountered on the third trip were saying they were the same men across all three instances. And on this third instance that he went missing, Huang said these two men put him on their backs and they flew him to 9 different cities around China for reasons unknown. And then they flew him back to Beigao and just dropped him off right outside his house near a tree. And that was it. Now, of course, this final disappearance sounds the most absurd because what? He was flying on the backs of people to all these different cities? That doesn't make any sense. But when Huang was kind of aggressively questioned about this third story, because it sounded the most made up as compared to the other two, It would turn out Huang had all this kind of insider information about each of the 9 cities that he supposedly was flown to by these 2 men. He knew the weather in each of those cities on the night that he was gone. He knew what shows were playing on the night he was gone. And he also just had really specific descriptions of where he was in each of these cities when they got there that all checked out. Now, you got to remember that getting that information correct would have been really hard for Huang at the time. He did not have internet access. He didn't have a phone. He didn't have a car. I mean, he lives in an isolated small village in rural China. So the idea that literally the morning after all this happens, he's flown to these different cities, that he would have all this information perfectly correct, that's hard to do. That would be hard to lie about. As of today, no one has ever been able to debunk Huang's stories. Basically, there's enough legitimacy and verifiable information in his stories that you really can't discount them. They really could have happened. Add in the fact that Huang actually took a lie detector test and passed it, and suddenly you're looking at a story that, as crazy as it sounds, really could have happened. And so Huang's story today is considered far and away the most famous UFO story in China's history, because the leading theory here is that Huang must have been abducted by aliens, and that's how he was being moved around to all these places, and maybe those 2 men that kept showing up in each of these events were the extraterrestrials that had scooped him up. Nobody knows, but that is the theory. As for Huang, he wishes none of this had ever happened, because his disappearances and whatever happened to him basically wrecked his life. His fiancée broke up with him because she was so uncomfortable around him, and there was a lot of stigma around Huang, especially in the village where everybody thought he was a liar. And then on top of that, all these news and film and TV crews came to the village because they wanted to shoot shows and documentaries about Huang, and Huang did not want anything to do with them. But again, like, all these people are coming to the village for Huang, and it's making the rest of the villagers upset. And then also there was a really lengthy investigation by the police and by the military to try to figure out how in the world Huang got into that army base. I mean, there were layers and layers of security that he somehow got through, and all those armed guards that were watching the gates said they never saw Huang walk through, even though Huang said he literally just walked through the gate with the 2 soldiers that were carrying him through. And so today, Huang actually still lives in Beigao, and he had a son and a daughter, and he has grandkids, but he refuses to talk about what happened to him because, again, it wrecked his life. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, which has hundreds of stories, a lot like this one, but many of them are only on the podcast. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts for free, or you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. Today's story is about an event that was so horrifying, the one person who survived it couldn't speak when she finally stumbled bloody and terrified out of the forest. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please send the like button on a blind date with Karen to a restaurant that has less than perfect service and no manager on duty. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. By 1993, Ludmila Korovina, who was a 41-year-old Russian hiking instructor, came under fairly intense criticism from her colleagues for being too survivalist with her students. They thought she was a little bit too aggressive with how she pushed her students, putting them in unnecessarily risky situations out in the wild where they weren't really ready for it, and at any point she might push them too far and wind up getting someone killed. Her students, however, absolutely adored her. They said on the mountains she was fearless and in tune with nature, and they felt very safe around her. And then at camp, she was very motherly and tender and always took the time to make sure all of her students were taken care of well before she was. Former students have said the mentorship they received from Ludmila went well beyond just hiking instruction. They said she taught a mindset that they carried with them into adulthood, and they pointed to as one of the main reasons they were successful later in life. In the summer of 1993, Ludmila was scheduled to lead an expedition up to the Hamar Daban Ridge, which is in eastern Siberia, and it's one of the oldest mountains on the planet. With her on this expedition would be 6 fairly experienced hiking students that ranged in ages from 15 to 24 years old. One of those 6 students was a 23-year-old young man named Sasha, who, although he was not Ludmila's biological son, she called him her son because she had raised him ever since he was a young child, and he looked at Ludmila as his mother. Sasha also happened to be the most physically fit and competent of all 6 hiking students, and he would function more like an assistant to Ludmila on this particular hike rather than a pupil. The other 5 students were 24-year-old Tatiana, 19-year-old Dennis, 16-year-old Victoria, 15-year-old Timur, and 17-year-old Valentina, who she is the only reason we know anything about the horrible things that happened to this group up on Hamar Daban Ridge. On August 1st, 1993, Ludmila and her hiking group boarded a Trans-Siberian railway car in Kazakhstan, and later that day they arrived in a town called Marino, which is on the eastern side of Siberia on the southern end, and it butts up against the base of the Hamar Daban mountain range. The Hamar Daban mountain was not considered a very dangerous hike to make. It was relatively small. It was just under 2,400 meters in elevation, and in the summertime, you'd have scores of recreational hikers all over this mountain range. Plus, the weather forecast for Ludmila and her group's multi-day hike in that mountain range was going to be incredibly favorable. It was going to be warm, clear, nice summer weather. Ludmila had charted a course that began just outside of the town of Marino, which is the town they were staying in that first night. They were going to start next to Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake in Russia. From the lake, they were going to move north and inland over this stretch that was totally barren. There was no trees, it was just rocks and grass, before ultimately reaching the Hamar Daban Ridge, which was their destination. And at that point, there would be shelter and firewood, and they could take a break before ultimately descending. And so in total, from the lake all the way to Hamar Daban Ridge was approximately 50 miles. Ludmila's group would not be the only group making this particular movement towards Hamar Daban Ridge. They'd be taking their own path, but there'd be 2 other groups that were on similar courses, basically parallel to them, making their way up to the ridge. And one of those groups was actually led by Ludmila's 16-year-old biological daughter, and they had actually made plans to meet up on one of the last days of this multi-day hike. As they were making their descent, there was a forest they were going to meet up in. So Ludmila and her 6 students stayed the night in Marino, and the next morning they got up early and made their way over to Lake Baikal. The weather's beautiful, they're excited to start their journey, and they take off. And everything was going great until the late afternoon. It would turn out the weather forecasters were just completely wrong, and as soon as the group climbed above the tree line, the temperatures plummeted and it started raining and snowing on them. It was just absolutely miserable. This treacherous weather would persist over the next few days, and it really started to destroy the morale in the group. But Ludmila, she was a pro, and she had hiked in far worse conditions than this, and so she made a point of telling the group that this stuff happens. Bad weather happens. We are prepared. We are trained. We're going to be fine. You need to have a positive attitude about this. We need to just keep pushing forward and not play a victim here. And that was enough to inspire the group to just keep on going. You know, they believed in Ludmila, and she's telling them to keep going, so they kept going. By the evening of August 4th, so this is 3 full days of hiking later, they were only about 30 minutes away from the summit. They have now reached the point where they are in the open section of the mountain where there is no reprieve from the wind or the rain or the snow. There's no trees to block anything. And so it's just an absolute abomination trying to climb this last stretch. Every step is like an eternity as the wind just cuts through their clothes and they're soaking wet and miserable. Ludmila's students were not about to ask for a break. They knew how she operated. She was someone that really believed in pushing through your own pain and fatigue and misery, and she always led by example, and they saw her, right out in front leading the charge up towards the Hamar Daban Ridge. And so they were very surprised when she stopped and she turned around and told them, we're taking a break. And in fact, we're actually going to camp out for the night right where we are right here. No one knows why Ludmila made this decision. On the one hand, it does make sense to take a break and say, you know what, we'll reach the summit tomorrow. We've had a really hard couple of days here with the bad weather. We'll make camp and we'll get some rest and we'll hit the summit tomorrow. That makes sense. But where she elected to make camp does not make sense. She had them stop right smack dab in the middle of this totally open section of the mountain where there are no trees, there's no objects to protect them from the horrible wind and snow and ice and rain that's just going to be pelting them all night. And so some people have speculated that when she looked at her crew of hikers, they were so badly beaten down and tired and miserable that she knew she could not ask them to go any further. And so that was why she said, let's just make camp here, we'll make do. Others have said her map may not have been very accurate. And so she didn't know how close she was to the summit, where at the summit there was literally a shelter that had firewood and a place for you to rest. Maybe she didn't know she was so close. Perhaps she thought she was much farther away and this is the best we can do. But what the inaccurate map theory does not account for is Ludmila would have known there is a forest about 2.5 miles down the mountain, because the whole time they've been on this hike, they've tried to stay up above the tree line as they make this final approach up to the ridge. And so she would have known there's a forest right down there. And if I wanted to, I could go down there and seek shelter in the trees. And so for whatever reason, she decided that we can't go down to the forest, we got to stay here. And so perhaps that lends more credibility to the idea that the group was far more beaten down than maybe we even realize. And she thought they can't make the 2.5 mile journey. We're going to have to just make camp here and make do. But regardless of her reasoning, they did make camp right in the middle of this open section. They set up 2 wet, crappy tents, and they used their little kerosene stoves to make a tiny meal. And then they all crammed inside of these 2 tents and huddled as the wind howled outside. That night, the storm got much worse. The wind picked up, and again, they're totally exposed on this open section of the mountain. And so they're just getting destroyed by this wind. And at about 2 a.m., the wind actually broke the ropes that were holding the tents down, and they had to go outside and retie them, and they were able to do that. And then a couple hours later, at about 4 a.m., the wind actually lifted up the section of the tent that was facing where the wind was blowing, and it pulled the tent up in such a way that water rushed into the tent and soaked their sleeping bags. And they were able to go outside, and they put the stakes back down in the ground, but they were sleeping in wet sleeping bags in the middle of this mountain in the middle of a storm. So this is getting quite dangerous at this point. But they were able to eventually fall asleep. And at about 10 a.m. the next morning, Ludmila gets up and looks outside, and she can see that everything is frozen, that it's snowed and the temperatures have dropped again, and everything is just snow and ice. And she knows that, we're actually reaching very dangerous hypothermia territory. And if we don't warm up soon, this could be life-threatening. And so she woke everybody up and she said, we need to go down into that forest and we need to start a fire as soon as possible. And so everybody said, all right, they got up, they started packing up their things, rolled up their tents, and they began walking down the mountain in a line. Although this was not intended, when Ludmila had said, we will reach the summit tomorrow, that had delayed their schedule. And it meant they were not going to be able to meet up with her daughter the next day. But now in the morning, when they're deciding basically to abandon the summit and turn around and head down again, they were now back on schedule to meet up with her daughter down in the forest. However, her daughter said she was at the rendezvous point in the forest, and Ludmila and the 6 other hikers never showed. 4 days later, on August 9th, a group of Ukrainian kayakers were making their way down this river in southern Siberia, and they were passing by the Hamar-Daban mountain range. And so as they're kind of slowly moving their way down, it's this beautiful morning, and they're looking up at the mountains all around them. The leader of this group happens to see something move on his left side. There's a forest right up against the left side of this river, and he turns his head and he has to do a double take because there is this girl who's standing there at the edge of the forest looking out at them totally expressionless, and she's covered in blood and she's not doing anything. She's just standing there. And at first, he actually thought, we need to leave. His first thought was, we need to just get away from this person. There's something wrong with this person. But very quickly, the group realized, we cannot abandon this girl. This is a young girl who should not be out here. I don't know what she's doing out here. And so they turned around and they went on shore and they yelled to her. They said, are you okay? And she just stood there not reacting. And they tried a couple more times to say, hey, we're not going to hurt you. We just want to know what's going on. And she didn't say a word. She just stood there in shock. She looked very scared. They finally got up right next to her and they asked her, what are you so scared of? Where are you coming from? And they just could not get her to speak. But they're up close looking at her, and she's got blood all over her. She looks dirty. She looks like she might be sick. And so they decide that, this girl needs help, and they had blankets. And so they threw blankets over her. They put her in one of the kayaks and they brought her back to town. Once in town, the Ukrainian kayakers went and got authorities and said, hey, we found this girl You know, she was covered in blood, walking out of the forest. We have no idea what's going on with her. And so authorities came over to speak to her. And although she barely spoke, she would finally say that she was 17 years old. Her name was Valentina Yotachenko, and that she had been a part of a 7-person hiking group up along the Hamar-Daban Ridge. And then she paused, and they said, well, where's your hiking group? How did you get separated? This is what she told them. Back on the morning of August 5th, so this would have been the morning after that terrible night's sleep on the mountain where the tent ropes are breaking and their sleeping bags are getting soaking wet. Well, Valentina wakes up and she looks outside of the tent and she sees Ludmila, and she's standing there with her hands on her hips and she's looking around. She looks very concerned. Valentina goes out there and Ludmila turns to her and says, we need to leave. We need to go down to the forest and we need to make a fire. Can you help me wake everybody up and start having them pack up their stuff so we can get moving? So Valentina goes in, she starts waking people up, and everybody very quickly packs up the tent, packs up their things, and they're in a line and they start walking down the mountain. They had only made it about 10 meters into their descent when Sasha, the 23-year-old young man that Ludmila considered her son, he just suddenly falls. And the other hikers, Valentina included, run over and they help get him up again, and he looks kind of shaken. He takes a couple more steps and he falls again. And this time when Valentina goes over to try to help him up with the others, they see his eyes are wide and he looks like he's really terrified, and then blood starts rushing out of his nose and his ears and his mouth, and then he just suddenly dies. And Ludmila runs over and she grabs him and she's panicking and she's trying to feel for a pulse and she's checking for his heart. And then she screams out in pain and anguish and she yells, he's dead. The other hikers can't believe this is happening. They can't even process that someone, any of them, had died, let alone it be Sasha, the most physically fit and healthy one of all of them, including up until a few minutes ago. He wasn't showing any signs or symptoms that something was wrong. He was perfectly fine. What's going on? Ludmila was in shock. She's on the ground and she's holding on to Sasha and she's telling the group that she's not going anywhere. She's staying with Sasha. And Valentina would say the group is just falling apart at this point. You have some of them that are crying, others who are just standing there looking around like, what's happening to us right now? And at some point, Ludmila collects herself and she says to the group, go down to the forest. Go down to the forest and start a fire. And Valentina said they didn't want to leave her and they were pleading with her to let them stay. And she said, no, go down to the forest and start a fire. And finally, Valentina said the group would. They'd get together and they'd turn around, and not really knowing what was going to happen next, they just begin walking down this mountain, and they only get a few steps before they hear Ludmila yell out to come back. She's saying, I can't move. And they turn around and Valentina was towards the front of the returning group as they're going back up the mountain, back to Ludmila. And she's now bleeding out of her nose and her ears and her mouth. And she's heaving like something's going on inside of her. And then all of a sudden she keels over on top of Sasha and she dies right in front of them. And now the group is in hysterics, and Valentina's in the front and she can't see anybody else. And then she turns around and she can't believe what she's seeing to her side. Now everybody else is bleeding from their nose and their ears and their mouth, and some of them are frothing from the mouth. Valentina reached for her mouth and her ears and her nose to look for blood, and there wasn't any. And then she turned and she saw 16-year-old Victoria and 24-year-old Tatiana suddenly fall to the ground, just like Sasha had, except they weren't just laying there. They began rolling around and ripping their clothes off and clutching at their throats, and they're frothing at the mouth. And so Valentina reaches down to try to help Victoria, the 16-year-old, and Victoria bites her on the hand and she pulls her hand back. And then Victoria curls into a ball and then goes still. And then Tatiana begins hitting her head on a rock over and over and over again until she goes still. At this point, Valentina is in pure survival mode, and so she looks at the other two, which was 15-year-old Timur and 19-year-old Dennis. Everybody else is down on the ground at this point. And she sees Dennis is moving behind a rock, and he looks like he's not acting as erratic as everybody else. And so she starts making her way over to Dennis to see if he's going to be okay. And on the way, she sees 15-year-old Timur fall to the ground, and he's suddenly lying there still. And so she believes he's dead too. She gets over to Dennis, and he's bleeding profusely from all of his orifices in his head, but he's talking to her. And he's saying, okay, you need to go back to your bag, get out whatever you can that is essential, ditch the rest, and run down to the forest, and I'll meet you down there. And so Valentina says, okay. She makes her way up to her bag. She gets her sleeping bag and a couple other small items. And when she turns around to go back to Dennis, she sees that he's now slouched over his backpack, and now the blood is just pouring out of his head, and she can tell that almost certainly he's dead as well. And so not only is she all alone, she's now totally traumatized and believes whatever has happened to them is going to happen to her. And so she runs down the mountain and she goes into the forest and she gets underneath this rock overhang. She puts her sleeping bag down, she crawls inside, and she drifts in and out of consciousness for the rest of the day. And then that night, she's still laying there and the storm picked up dramatically and she could hear all night these huge trees all over the mountain falling and slamming all around her. And so she's thinking, if I don't die from whatever killed my friends, I'm going to get hit by one of these trees. But she manages to get through the night. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and so Valentina gets up, and she's thinking to herself, maybe by some miracle, one of them is still alive. And so she climbs back up the mountain to where they were, and she finds all of them still laying exactly where they were when she left them, all motionless, all deceased. And so she decides to go one by one and close each of their eyelids. And then she says her goodbye, and then she turns and kind of wanders back into the forest, where she would stay for the next 4 days, desperately walking around, hoping to be rescued at some point, the whole time just expecting to die, either from exposure, from an animal attack, from whatever killed my friends. Eventually she does hear voices and she starts making her way towards where they're coming from, and that's when she gets to the river and she sees the Ukrainian kayakers who ultimately pick her up and bring her back to town. After authorities heard Valentina's story and realized there were other hikers out there, they launched a search party, and it would take them a month to locate them. Their bodies were contorted and their faces were locked in these grimaces that looked like they were in absolute terror and agony right as they died. In addition to missing most of their clothing and their shoes, they were also all missing their eyeballs. The autopsies were only able to conclude that hypothermia contributed to their death, although it wasn't the only factor, as well as a protein deficiency, despite the fact that they had all eaten well over the course of their trip, and that all of their lungs were very bruised, but they didn't know what that was from. But nothing the autopsy concluded could reconcile what Valentina said she saw happen, which was a sudden, violent death of 6 healthy people with no signs and symptoms leading up. Suddenly, they are bleeding out of every orifice and they're falling to the ground, tearing their clothes off, grabbing at their throats, frothing at the mouth, and then dying. And whatever happened to them, why didn't it happen to Valentina? To this day, we don't really have a good answer why that happened, and the case is closed. It was ruled they mostly died of hypothermia and it was an accident, and that's that. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened in Russia. In 1959, 9 very experienced Russian hikers set off on a 16-day expedition into the Ural Mountains in the Soviet Union, and about 10 days into their hike, they reached a part where they needed to crest over this mountain before some bad weather rolled in. And they started moving up this mountain, which would be renamed the Dyatlov Pass after the leader of this group. His name is Dyatlov. They started making their way up the Dyatlov Pass, and they were going too slowly, and the weather was coming in too quickly. And so they had to make a critical decision. Stay put, but be in this totally exposed, open mountain face, much like the Hamar Daban situation where they were up on that open mountain face. Either hunker down there and get ruined by weather, and the weather was a lot worse for the Dyatlov Pass group. It was, sub-zero temperatures and just snowing ruthlessly. Or they could go down and give up ground and go down to the forest at the base of this mountain where you'd be sheltered from the storm with some trees. And so these hikers, who might be a little bit overconfident in their ability, decide to stick it out right on this mountain face. And over the course of that night, at some point, they cut open their tent with a knife from the inside and ran out into sub-zero temperatures, most of them not wearing shoes, not wearing jackets, not wearing pants. They're basically in underwear. And they calmly walked down the mountain, all the way down to the forest. And once they got down there, 2 of them tried to desperately climb this big tree where there wasn't any low-hanging branches. And so they couldn't climb up it. We don't know what they were trying to climb up it for, but they ended up building this little tiny fire that could not have provided very much warmth at all. And they were found deceased lying around this fire. The 7 other hikers were found in 2 different areas. One that appeared to go down to that tree where those 2 were, but then doubled back and tried to get up to the campsite, but didn't make it and fell to the ground and died there. The other group was not found for a couple of weeks later. They were found at the mouth of this river. They were inside of this den, and they were wearing the clothes of the other hikers that were deceased. And the clothes they had on had traces of radiation on them. And the ones that were in the den had these devastating chest and skull injuries, and one of them was missing their eyeballs. And the official statement by the Soviet Union was they died from an unknown compelling force, which is a really mysterious way to describe how someone might die. This case was actually reinvestigated in 2020, and the new cause of death is death by avalanche. Except loads of people disagree with that. In fact, experts have gone out to where this happened, and they say not only was there no avalanche, there's never been an avalanche in this area. There's literally never been one. So what do you think? Is there a connection between MrBallen and the Dyatlov Pass incident? Is there a cover-up in both cases where something far more sinister has happened to both groups that we don't know about? Or are they unrelated and these are just both examples of Mother Nature being far more powerful than we even realize? So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you caught today's secret in the video, please let us know in the comment section what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's story and you haven't done this already, please send the like button out on a blind date with Karen at a restaurant that is below perfect service and does not have a manager on call that night. Also, please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's just JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Today, I'm going to share 3 progressively more unbelievable stories, and at the end of each of them, I will share the famous photo or photos that are associated with them. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please unpair all of the Bluetooth devices connected to the like button's phone. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Early on the afternoon of October 12, 1960, a 17-year-old high school student named Otoya Yamaguchi stood alone in his brother's house in the city of Tokyo, Japan, waiting for a tea kettle of water to boil. It was a Wednesday, so Otoya should have been at school, but that day he had gone to school and then snuck out a side door during lunch. More and more often these days, Otoya was feeling like school was kind of meaningless. It was hard for him to sit in history class and watch all of his classmates diligently take notes when, in Otoya's mind, he felt like all the real history was happening outside of the classroom. Just then, the kettle on the stove began to whistle, which meant the water was boiling, and so Otoya grabbed the kettle, he took it off the burner, and he poured it over a tea bag in a cup. And as Otoya began to stir his tea, he began to go over what he was going to do later that day. It was undeniable that Otoya had a very difficult afternoon in store. He had a meeting with a person who was very important, and during this meeting, Otoya would have to deliver some very bad news. In fact, this news was so bad that Otoya had decided what he was going to do was literally write down this bad news and hand deliver it. Now, Otoya had not quite figured out what he was going to write, but he knew whatever it was, it would have to be perfect. For months now, Otoya had been trying to articulate this bad news that was really weighing heavily on him to his peers and to adults and to anybody who would listen, but nobody took Otoya seriously. Adults would look at Otoya and think, oh, that's just some kid, what he's talking about can't be serious, and when Otoya would talk to classmates, they would just kind of laugh at him. Otoya frowned and he looked out the window and he thought to himself, maybe this whole time I've been coming off as too angry when I talk about this bad news. Maybe I need to change the way I talk about it to sound more sincere. And as Otoya was thinking about this, he suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I know exactly what to write. And so Otoya abandoned his tea and ran over to his brother's desk. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and he started writing. Over the last year, Otoya had felt like he had really grown up and really started to find his true self.
He had been raised in a very strict household. His father was a colonel in the Japanese military, and he expected Otoya to be obedient and polite, and so that was what Otoya had done. But a couple of years earlier, Otoya had managed to secure a spot in a high school in Tokyo, far from where he had grown up, far from his father, and Otoya was really excited. He felt like going to this high school in Tokyo would finally allow him to kind of get out from under his dad's strict authoritarian rule. And his father had let him go to the high school in Tokyo, but after only a couple of weeks, it turned out Otoya's father had decided, nope, I don't want you to go there, and he had insisted that Otoya come back home and go to a Catholic school closer to their hometown. And it was at this point that Otoya, for the first time really in his whole life, he decided to push back against his dad. And so even though Otoya did come home, he did go to this Catholic school, as soon as he was home, he began constantly begging his dad to let him return to Tokyo, let him go back and live with his brother who lived in Tokyo, and let him go to the high school that he loved. And eventually, surprisingly, Otoya's father relented and said, okay, fine, you can go to Tokyo, you can do what you want. And so Otoya had been totally overjoyed. He had returned to Tokyo, gotten re-enrolled in the high school. But after only a couple of months, Otoya had kind of lost interest in the school, and instead his focus had now shifted to politics. Otoya's brother, who Otoya lived with in Tokyo, was very into politics, and he was always taking Otoya to speeches and rallies, and very quickly Otoya had gotten into it. And eventually, Otoya began to think that his purpose in life was in politics, and he just didn't like the idea of having to wait until he graduated from high school to pursue that career ambition. But when Otoya brought these ambitions up to anyone who would listen, no one took him seriously. They looked at him as a skinny, scrawny, kind of meek little guy who was not going to make a difference in the world. But Otoya begged to differ. By now, Otoya was almost done with this note he was writing, and so he looked up and he checked the clock. He saw it was 2 p.m., which meant he really needed to get going soon. He was going to go to a political debate at the Hibiya Public Hall in downtown Tokyo, and the very important person he was going to meet and deliver this bad news to was going to be at this debate. Otoya took one more look down at the note he had just written, and he read it over a couple of times, and he realized he was missing one more line at the bottom. And so he leaned down and he wrote, quote, "I can't forgive you." Feeling like he was done, he folded up the note, put it in his pocket. He stood up, he grabbed his school uniform jacket and put it on, and then he grabbed this package that he had got from his father's house and he put it under his arm, and then he headed out the front door. Otoya always loved the walk downtown. The hall where this debate was going to take place was near the Imperial Palace, and it was this big, imposing building with a terracotta and stone facade that always inspired Otoya every time he saw it. When Otoya arrived at the hall, he saw loads of people streaming in through the front doors for this debate, and so Otoya joined them and made his way inside, and he moved towards the back of the auditorium, and then he began scanning the audience. And he saw there was at least 2,000 people inside, happily chatting and laughing and waiting for this thing to start. But all Otoya could think about was where this person was that he was going to be meeting, because as he was looking around, he didn't see them. At around 2:45 p.m., the moderator of this debate walked up onto the stage down in front. He went to the podium, he grabbed the mic, and he began telling the audience to take their seats and to be quiet, and then he began to explain the rules for this debate. Otoya, at this point, was really only half listening because he was still looking all around the inside of this hall for this person he was going to meet. Where are they? They're not here. 15 minutes later, at around 3 p.m., the moderator left the podium and a new speaker came out on stage. He was a politician named Inajiro Asanuma, and he was the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. But when he began to speak and all the thousands of people in attendance leaned in to listen, Otoya was totally not listening because he could now see the person he was going to meet had arrived. Careful not to cause a disturbance, Otoya moved from the back of the auditorium over to the side of the building, and he began walking up a side aisle, only stopping briefly near a trash can where he pulled out that package he had brought from his father's house, and he unwrapped it and he threw the wrapping away and held on to what was inside of the package. And then Otoya looked down at what he was holding, he took a deep breath, and then he looked up and broke into a run. What happened next was broadcast live on television all across Japan, and by that evening, the footage had gone so viral that it was basically all over the world. A photographer who happened to be in the crowd of people watching this debate also happened to take a very iconic photo of what happened next involving Otoya, and that photo would actually go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1961. The Pulitzer Prize is a really big deal. It's the most prestigious award for journalism. It would turn out the very important person that Otoya was supposed to meet inside of this hall during this debate was in fact the speaker on stage at 3 p.m., Inajiro Asanuma, the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. And the package that Otoya had brought from his father's house to this meeting was a samurai sword. And so after Otoya unwrapped the sword, he took a deep breath and then ran up on stage, charged to the podium, pulled back the sword, and plunged it into Asanuma's torso before he could do anything. And the photographer out in the crowd who would win the Pulitzer happened to snap a photo right as Otoya was pulling the sword out of Asanuma and getting ready to stab him again. Onlookers would immediately rush the stage and tackle Otoya, but the damage was already done. Asanuma would pass away from his injuries within the hour. It would turn out Otoya, ever since moving to Tokyo, had become a radical right-wing ultranationalist. The note that Otoya had carefully penned and then folded up and put in his pocket before carrying out this assassination basically just said that Otoya did not hate Asanuma personally, but Asanuma was slowly transforming Japan into a communist country, and so Otoya could not forgive him for that. And so Otoya decided he needed to act. Otoya was immediately arrested, but 2 weeks later, while he was in prison, he would take his own life. There is exactly one YouTube channel that I personally religiously follow. It's called Bedtime Stories, and it's like the most epic storytelling. And my goodness, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, you will be a fan of Bedtime Stories. They cover strange, crazy stories as well, and it's just masterfully done. But I'm not here today just to tell you how great Bedtime Stories is. I'm here today because I have an announcement. Bedtime Stories is starting a podcast, and it's going to fall under the Ballen Studios banner. We're working together. It's super cool. But here's the even bigger news. Not only is Bedtime Stories a brand new Ballen Studios podcast, it is live right now. New episodes of the Bedtime Stories podcast will air each week on Wednesday, but right now the first 3 episodes of the podcast are available wherever you get your podcasts. So go and mule kick the Bedtime Stories follow button right in the solar plexus and get hooked on them just like I did. But first, check out this clip from the trailer for Bedtime Stories.
Turn off the lights, get into bed, and turn up the volume. It's time for a creepy bedtime story. From Ballen Studios, welcome to Bedtime Stories, a new weekly show that will truly immerse you in a strange, dark, and mysterious world and haunt your dreams. We'll bring you true stories from around the world, from the paranormal to the supernatural, unsolved mysteries, strange deaths, cryptids, and the most disturbing of true crime, all told in a unique and bone-chilling way. New episodes every Wednesday. Follow Bedtime Stories wherever you get your podcasts. Bedtime Stories.
On a sunny afternoon in October of 2015, a 39-year-old man named Richard Jones walked along the perimeter of the yard inside of the state prison in Kansas, where Richard was serving time for a robbery. Up ahead, Richard could see there was a small basketball court with one hoop on it, and on the blacktop were dozens of other inmates that were exercising and chatting and socializing, and Richard actually knew most of them because he had been in prison for 16 years now, and Richard was also a very likable guy who was very outgoing and personable, and so he made friends really easily, even in prison. And so as Richard continued his walk in the direction of the basketball court, he saw one of the guys on the blacktop broke free from the group and began moving towards Richard. And Richard immediately recognized who it was. It was his good friend, Steve. And Richard was about to give him a friendly wave when he noticed Steve looked really mad. And so Richard actually just stopped and stared at Steve as he slowly approached him, and as he got closer, Richard could see Steve's fists were balled up and his face was in a scowl. I mean, Steve looked like he was coming over to fight Richard. And so when Steve got about 10 feet away from Richard, Richard actually spoke up before Steve could say anything, and he said, "Steve, what's going on? Why are you so upset?" Steve was kind of a hothead, and Richard knew that, but a lot of times, even when he got mad about things, it would blow over really quickly. And so this was kind of routine, but Richard just couldn't think of a reason for why Steve would be mad at him. And so Steve walks right up to Richard and he goes, "Oh, so now you want to talk to me?" Richard was immediately confused and kind of turned his head sideways and was like, "What?" Steve stared at Richard, kind of expecting Richard to eventually apologize or something, but eventually he noticed that Richard really was not sure what he was talking about. And so Steve was like, "This morning, I went up to you at the cafeteria line, I tried to talk to you, and you completely blew me off and walked away in front of a big group of people. That really embarrassed me and made me look bad." And Richard was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't even see you this morning. I don't know where this is coming from." Steve was not buying it, and he was like, "Richard, I know it was you. I saw you this morning. I spoke to you this morning. You did that." And Richard was like, "No, really, Steve, I'm sorry. I have no idea what this is about." And so these two continued to go back and forth on this, and then at some point they both kind of noticed that they were drawing lots of attention because they are in prison and any sort of confrontation immediately draws eyeballs. And so when they noticed other inmates were kind of beginning to walk over to see what was going on, and the guards were starting to notice, Steve just said, "You know what, Richard, fine. I guess I must have made a mistake. No big deal." And he turned and he ran back to the basketball court. After Steve had left, Richard continued his walk around the perimeter, but that exchange with Steve had really weirded him out because this was actually not the first time something like this had happened. It all started a month ago when an inmate that Richard didn't know came up to him like he definitely knew him and said to Richard, "Hey, how's your grandmother? I heard she fell down, is she okay?" And at first Richard was like, "Wait a minute, is my grandmother okay? Did she fall?" But then Richard eventually realized that this inmate thought Richard was someone that he wasn't. Now, at first, Richard thought this was just kind of like a weird one-off event, but every few days after this first time, something else would happen. Either an inmate who Richard didn't know would come up to him and be really friendly with him, as if they knew Richard, but Richard clearly didn't know them, or someone Richard did know would come up to him and accuse him of odd behavior that Richard couldn't remember doing, like the interaction he had with Steve when Steve came up and said, "You snubbed me in the lunch line." And so after Richard's interaction with Steve, Richard began to think, wait a minute, is someone screwing with me? Is that what's been going on? The next morning, during breakfast, Richard decided not to sit where he normally did, and instead he sat on the very far side in the corner of the cafeteria to basically just be able to people watch all the people inside the cafeteria. And then that afternoon, when Richard was outside, instead of walking around the perimeter like he liked to do, he just sat in a central location and just constantly scanned the whole yard. Now, Richard didn't really know what he was actually looking for. He just figured, maybe I'll see something suspicious, I'll see someone staring at me for too long, or I'll see someone I don't know talking to my friends. Something will tip me off to what's been going on for the past couple of weeks. But despite all this careful people watching he was doing, Richard didn't see anything suspicious until 1 week after the interaction Richard had with Steve about snubbing him in the lunch line. Richard was sitting in the cafeteria again when he noticed something very strange on the other side of the cafeteria. And when he saw it, he just stood up and stared, and he felt his heart starting to race faster, and he felt his breath speeding up, and Steve actually was sitting next to him and said, "Hey, Richard, what's going on?" And Richard couldn't even find the words. He just raised his arm up and pointed to the other side of the room. When Richard had originally been arrested 16 years earlier, it was for robbing someone in a Walmart parking lot. Richard had always claimed he did not do it, but multiple witnesses had pulled Richard out of a lineup saying that's the guy. And the woman who actually got robbed told police she overheard the getaway driver yelling to Rick, the man who had robbed her, to get in the car so they could leave. And Rick is a nickname for Richard. Richard had insisted he was at a barbecue in another state at the time of this robbery, and so it really couldn't have been him. But the evidence was just overwhelming, and so eventually he was convicted. Richard had never been able to understand why so many people 16 years earlier had insisted that he was the one who committed that crime. And more recently, he couldn't understand why his friends, like Steve, were accusing him of doing things that he didn't remember doing. But that night in the jail cafeteria, when Richard spotted something on the other side of the room, suddenly everything over the last 16 years made perfect sense. Richard really was an innocent man. He did not rob that woman in the Walmart parking lot. His doppelganger had. A doppelganger is someone who looks exactly like you, but they're not actually related to you. It's just genetic chance that somebody else on the planet looks just like you. And it just so happened that Richard's doppelganger, who was this man named Ricky Amos, so it just so happened as well that the doppelganger shared basically the same first name, Ricky and Richard. Well, this doppelganger, Ricky, just happened to be sent to the same prison that Richard was at for a totally unrelated crime. These two men have never met. There's no connection whatsoever. They just look the same. And when Richard looked across the cafeteria and saw Ricky, it was like looking at a clone of himself, and it all clicked. All the people that were coming up to him saying, "You were doing this and acting weird." Well, those people, Stephen included, were actually interacting with his doppelganger, Ricky. And 16 years earlier, Ricky was the one who committed that robbery in Walmart, and the victim and the witnesses, they all confused Ricky for Richard. Here are Richard and Ricky's photographs side by side. Once a judge was made aware of this situation and saw the two photos side by side, he knew the police had made a mistake. Even the prosecutor who had tried Richard in the robbery case supported his release. Richard was freed in 2017 and got a $1 million settlement from the state. As for the doppelganger, Ricky Amos, he was never actually tried for the robbery 16 years earlier because by the time they figured out he was the robber, the case was too old to try. On the evening of March 15th, 2018, a 55-year-old man named Gian stumbled out of this fine dining restaurant in downtown Singapore and promptly threw up on the sidewalk. Pedestrians jumped back to get out of the way, and a woman in high heels and a beautiful fancy dress mumbled something insulting about how drunk Gian must be. But Gian was not drunk. He was totally sober, and now he was absolutely mortified. Gian was actually a businessman who was attempting to impress his clients at dinner, but as he had been sitting at the table with his clients, he had started to feel this pressure in his chest that became so intense that at some point he just had to get up and run outside and vomit. And so after Gian had stood up and wiped his mouth, he thought, now that he had been sick and thrown up, that he would feel better. But as he was standing there, he noticed the pressure in his chest had not been relieved at all. And so, as much as Gian wanted to stick around and talk more with his clients, he felt like the only thing he could do now was to go in and politely excuse himself for the rest of the night and just go home and sleep off whatever was going on with him. But when Gian went back into the restaurant and was actually back at his table, before he could even say a sentence to his clients explaining the situation, he was turning around and running back outside and vomiting on the street again. At this point, Gian knew something was definitely wrong, and so he didn't have time to tell his clients what was going on. He just needed to get to a hospital. And so he sprinted across the street, got in his car, and began driving. When he got to the hospital, he was so scared about what was happening to him that he actually parked his car crooked in the spot and left his door open as he sprinted towards the emergency room. And then once he was inside the hospital, he ran up to the receptionist and tried to tell them what was going on, but he literally couldn't speak. And then he just collapsed in a chair right nearby. Now, the hospital was extremely busy, but all the nurses could tell whatever was going on with this man, it could not wait. And so they ran over to him, they lifted him up, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him into a private exam room. And then once he was in there, they began taking his vitals, and also they began assessing him, looking for some sort of trauma on the outside of his body that could explain what was going on with him, but they couldn't find anything. And so after they were sure that Gian was stable, he was breathing okay, his heart rate was okay, he just couldn't speak, but he was going to be okay, the team decided that the next thing they should do would be to give him a CT scan. A CT scan is a specialized type of imaging that can show what's going on inside someone's body. It's like a really detailed X-ray. And after they gave Jian a CT scan, his results were baffling. There was this solid, fairly large, white object that was lodged at the base of Jian's esophagus. Your esophagus sits below your throat and above your stomach. It's basically the tube that food goes through to get to your stomach. But whatever was stuck inside of Jian's esophagus was not something that looked like food. It actually kind of looked like a human hand. Now, the doctors had no idea what this thing was, and you gotta remember that they really don't have much information here. All they know is this middle-aged guy who's dressed really well has come running into the hospital, he can't speak, and he's collapsed. And here we are. He has this obstruction in his esophagus. And so even though the doctors really had no idea what they were dealing with, what they knew is they had to get this foreign object out of Jian. So they wheeled Jian into the operating room for emergency surgery, and then at some point a doctor came in with this long skinny tube that had a camera at the top of it. Their first step for this operation was putting this camera down into Jian to see what this thing was that was stuck inside of his esophagus. And so after Jian was prepped for surgery, the doctor with this camera began snaking it down Jian's throat until finally the camera could actually see this white object in his esophagus. And when the camera revealed what this thing was, the entire medical team in the operating room just gasped. They could not believe what they were looking at. To understand what they were looking at, we have to go back several hours. That night, Jian had decided he really wanted to impress his wealthy clients. And so he had decided to take them to this very special restaurant that none of them had been to, and he wanted them to try a very special and very rare dish that this restaurant sold. It was called sanakji. Sanakji is a Korean delicacy that is very popular in certain circles. But it's also very dangerous. Every year in South Korea, at least 6 people die from eating sanakji. Because sanakji is just a living octopus. You literally eat the octopus as it's moving around, and the risk of it getting stuck in your throat is pretty high. And so as Jian is trying to eat this living octopus, the octopus decided it didn't want to be eaten, and so it flailed its tentacles around, and finally its suckers lodged onto his esophagus, and that's where it stopped. Now, we don't know how long this octopus remained alive inside of Jian's esophagus, but we know it was alive at least for a little bit, because after Jian managed to swallow it down, it kept wriggling around and grabbing and trying to escape, and that's what created that intense pressure in Jian's chest and kept causing him to go vomit. And so when the doctors put that camera down Jian's throat, they saw a whole octopus. The octopus was removed from Jian's esophagus, and 2 days later, Jian was discharged, fully recovered. It's unclear if Jian ever tried sanakji again.
At 4 a.m. on a winter day in 1993, a 50-year-old man named Joe walked down a dark hallway inside of his farmhouse in Kentucky. As he moved, he did his best to be as quiet as possible so as not to wake up his wife or son, who were sleeping nearby. But when Joe got about halfway down the hall, he happened to look inside the family room, and he thought he saw something moving. He strained his eyes to see who it was, thinking maybe it was his wife or son who had gotten up for some reason, but he just couldn't tell. However, as Joe stared into the darkness, he heard the sound of floorboards creaking inside the family room, and then before Joe could do anything, the thing he had seen moving was now rushing straight towards him. Hours later, Kentucky State Police would arrive at Joe's house, and what they would discover there was a monstrous crime that literally had never been committed before in this part of Kentucky.
So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's stories and you want more content like it, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories just like these that are available to listen to right now. That podcast is called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. When I was in college, I went on a cruise from Florida down to the Bahamas and then back. About halfway to the Bahamas, we hit some bad weather. The boat was rocking pretty aggressively to the point where we weren't allowed to go onto the upper decks of the ship. Chairs and tables were shifting around. The crew and the staff were unconcerned. This is something they've been through. They sail this route regularly. They know the ship is equipped to handle pretty rough weather. But as a passenger, it was really terrifying to just suddenly realized that despite the safety, the perceived safety of this huge multi-$100 million ship, the reality is when you're out in the ocean, Mother Nature's going to do whatever it's going to do. Now, fortunately, the weather did subside, and sure enough, the ship was fine and we sailed through it. But it always stuck with me that if you're out in the middle of the ocean and something goes bad, it goes really bad. The two stories I'm going to share are about groups of people that were out on the open ocean and something went bad. Very, very bad. Before we get going on today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3 to 4, sometimes even 5 times every week. And if that's of interest to you, I would encourage you to gently armbar the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of those weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the stories. In the very early hours of May 26, 2013, 3 tugboats were towing this massive Chevron oil tanker in the Gulf of Guinea. They were about 32 kilometers off the coast of Nigeria. 2 of the tugboats were pressed up against the sides of this huge tanker to provide stability as it gets towed. The 3rd tugboat, which was called the Gascon 4, sat way out in front and had the main tow line strapped to the front of the tanker and was doing all of the actual towing. On board that lead tugboat, the Gascon 4, were 12 crew members who had all been hired by a company called West African Ventures. It was a Nigerian-based company. They owned the ship, and they had contracted them to come out and be a part of this towing operation. One of the crew members was a man named Harrison O'Keefe. He was from Nigeria, and he was the ship's cook. At around 4:45 that morning, Harrison was in his quarters. He had been sleeping, but he had woken up because the ship was swaying pretty dramatically. It was very rough seas, but he, like the rest of the crew, were accustomed to rough, choppy water. So he gets up, he unlocks his bedroom door, and he goes out into the hall. When he looks down the hall, he sees that all of the other doors are shut and locked. The crew of the Gascon 4 had a policy that whenever they slept or were in their rooms, they would shut and lock the doors because piracy is a really big threat. After Harrison looked down the hall at all of these locked doors, he started making his way down the hall in the other direction towards the bathroom. He kind of stumbled down the hall as the ship rocked from the very rough seas. He gets to the bathroom and shuts the door at 4:50 in the morning. We know this because at 4:50 in the morning, a rogue wave hit the side of Gascon 4 and almost completely flipped it upside down. Snapped the tow line. The ship is completely on its side and it's sinking very fast. He tried to push open the metal bathroom door, but already a surge of water is coming down the hall and pressing him into the bathroom. Pushes against that surge of water and gets the door open, and now he's standing on the ceiling of the hallway that he was just in a moment ago because the boat is now completely inverted. And he's looking down the hall. 3 of the crew members have managed to come out of their locked rooms and in a panic are trying to make their way up to the exit. He sees them as another surge of water blasts in through one of the windows and literally sweeps them away. And he knows they're dead. The power cuts out right as another surge of water is coming down the hall to him. He turns his body and this rush of seawater, this freezing seawater, comes pouring down the hall, and it takes Harrison and throws him down this little hallway and slams him into yet another bathroom. It was actually an officer's bathroom. It was connected to an officer's room. And so now he's inside of this other bathroom, and he's kind of like clamoring naturally, instinctively to go up to try to get to air, because that's what anyone would do if you're underwater in a panic. And as he's swimming up, he couldn't believe it when he gets to air. His head clears the surface in the bathroom, and he's in an air pocket, but it's pitch black. All the power is out. The ship is rapidly sinking. The water is freezing. Harrison has only got his boxer shorts on. He doesn't have a light source, he doesn't have food, he doesn't have water, and he has this couple cubic feet of air that any moment he's waiting for it to collapse. He knows these are his final moments, and he remembers a prayer that his wife had texted him before he started this particular job, and he started reciting the prayer in his head as he waited to die. The ship slams into the ocean floor, but the air pocket doesn't collapse. So Harrison is in this tiny little air pocket 30 meters below the ocean's surface, At this point, even though Harrison has no idea how he just survived the shipwreck, he now has to deal with the fact that he's eventually going to run out of air. He'll die of dehydration. He'll die of exposure. He's in freezing water up to his neck. And most terrifyingly, sharks and other animals are going to start converging on the ship to look for food. And he is in a bathroom that, although there's the air pocket, the door is open into the main hall, and his entire body is inside of this bathroom, meaning if a shark were in the hallway, swimming down the inside of this hall and it made it to the bathroom, he's completely exposed with no way to shut the door. It was wedged open. So his lower half is completely exposed to whatever wildlife is inside of this ship. So he literally is just waiting to die. He just doesn't know how he's going to die. After sitting there for quite a while, he started to feel very cold, and he knew that if he didn't find a way to get his body a little bit higher into the air pocket, basically get his upper body out of the water, that he was certainly going to die soon, just from hypothermia. Even though he knew he was doomed, his will to live it was bubbling through. He did not want to die yet. And as he's sitting there thinking, how is he going to get himself up into this air pocket? Because he had nothing he could step on or kind of stand on. He realized that right next to him, there was the officer's room. This was the officer's bathroom. And the door was open. He could, if he wanted to, he could dive down and swim through the door and go into the officer's bedroom and look for supplies. And in his mind, he thought he could probably pull off some of the paneling, because it's going to be pitch black in there. If he just swam straight to the far side of the room, he could get to some of the fake wood paneling or whatever it was, and he could yank it down. And as he's building up his courage to dive into pitch black water, he starts hearing this horrible sound of large sea creatures smashing into the boat. They were basically looking for entrance points into the boat. And then they would come into the boat, sharks, and he could hear them bumping up against the insides of the ship. And all he's thinking is, I'm completely exposed. I'm doomed. I gotta go. I gotta go in there. I gotta at least make an attempt to save myself. And so, listening to sharks and other animals searching for things to eat, he takes a deep breath, and in total darkness, he dives down and swims into the officer's bedroom. And as he's swimming, because he's just going straight across to the far wall to start yanking off that paneling, he's bumping into things that he believes are bodies. He doesn't know, but he thinks they are. He gets to the far wall and he yanks off a piece of paneling. He swims back. One successful trip. He goes back down and he makes a number of trips until he's able to fashion that little raft he had in mind, like a little step stool that pushed him up into the air pocket to where half of his upper body was now out of the freezing water. Also, while he was in the officer's room, even though it was pitch black, he was kind of like feeling around for things, and he wound up finding a bottle of soda and a flashlight. So he turns on his flashlight and he drinks his soda and he just takes a breath. Even though he's still in the same terrible situation, he's thankful for that little victory. About 24 hours would go by where he has this light on and he's nursing the soda. He knows he's either gonna die from sharks, hypothermia, dehydration, something's going to kill him. But part of him is thinking, maybe if a dive team is able to locate the ship, they're going to come down to retrieve bodies. And maybe they'll find me. Maybe I can hold out that long. And so as he's thinking about this, he's getting a little flicker of hope. Two horrible things happen. His light goes out, flashlight doesn't work, at the same time that he describes hearing the large sea creatures make their way into the officer's room right next to him. So I want you to think about this. You're at the bottom of the ocean. You're in a ship that has sunk. You're in a little air pocket. You really don't have any supplies to last longer than a few days. It's total darkness. You had your flashlight, it's gone out. It's totally dark. A shark that has been eating your friends, or more than one shark, is now literally feet away from you, and you can hear it eating the bodies that apparently are in there. You are exposed to them, because there's an entrance to that room and there's an entrance to the hall. The fear must have been indescribable. For the next 36 hours, Harrison sat there listening to a shark slam into the wall but never attack him. He heard sharks in the main section of the ship bumping around, waiting at any moment that if the ship were to just tilt a little bit, his air pocket's gonna collapse. It's unfathomable how terrible those 36 hours must have been. At the 60-hour mark, he hears what sounds like something metal banging on the outside of the ship. He notices through the hallway, because he has a bit of a vantage point through the water down the hall in front of him, he sees a flicker of light. And there's no light down here, so it really stood out. Without even thinking about it, he takes a deep breath and swims right into the hallway, the one place he had not been since he had gone into the bathroom, because there are sharks. And he starts swimming farther and farther and farther away from his air pocket, and he's running out of air. He can't find the light. He doesn't even know if he saw a light. He thinks he might be hallucinating, and he's realizing, I'm almost out of air. He's looking around, and he decides, I gotta go back to my air pocket. And he turns around, he's trying to swim back. He's looking for his bathroom. He's swimming as fast as he can. He's about to run out of air, and he makes it to his air pocket, and his head goes up, and he takes a big breath. And he's not sure if he really actually saw the light or not. And he's thinking, that was it. I thought I was gonna be rescued, but I was just imagining it. And then a miracle. It was a diver. And the diver had come back. The diver was part of a crew that had been sent down to recover bodies. No one lives for 3 days underwater. So the diver comes down his way, and Harrison knew that he was going to scare the daylights out of this diver. And so he gently touched him on the back. And the diver reacts really violently because he's expecting it to be an animal of some kind. And Harrison reaches out and just grabs the diver's hand and squeezes it gently and shows him his hand. And the diver's got a big light on his head. Pokes his head up into this air pocket. You see this man that for the past 36 hours has been in total darkness with absolutely no way out. He was done for. And the look on Harrison's face is just, it's priceless. They fitted Harrison with a dive mask and they brought him up. He did not immediately go to the surface because he had been at depth for so long. He had to go through something called decompression. If he had just breathed air at normal pressure, he would have died. So they put him in a decompression chamber for 60 hours before actually bringing him to the surface. And so ultimately Harrison was okay, but the trauma of this experience was so extreme that to this day, Harrison's wife says that basically every night he wakes up thinking he's on a sinking ship. In October of 1982, Deborah Kiley and her 4 friends were hired by a billionaire to take his brand new luxury 18-meter yacht called the Trash Man from Maine all the way down to Florida. A pretty significant journey along the east coast of the United States. Deborah and her friends were very experienced sailors. They had done trips like this before, driving these luxury yachts around. This was just going to be a great trip. The weather was beautiful. The forecast looked perfect. And they were off. 2 days into their journey, when they were off the coast of North Carolina, a freak storm came out of nowhere, and all of a sudden their ship is in this massive, massive storm. And despite their best efforts to keep water from coming in, eventually the ship begins to sink. And so as the ship is clearly sinking, the crew has to abandon it, and they jump into the violently surging sea, and they climb aboard this little tiny life raft with no food, no water, no life-saving equipment. And Meg, who was one of her friends, one of Deborah's friends, had cut open her leg really badly when the ship was initially sinking. Something had fell and cut her leg. So she's bleeding into the water. As they clambered into this dinghy, Deborah remembers something nudging one of her legs and looking out and not just seeing 1 or 2 sharks, but she described seeing hundreds of sharks. 18-foot-long tiger sharks who will eat almost anything, including people, had detected Meg's bleeding leg when she was holding on to the dinghy before she climbed in. They had all swarmed the area, and they start feeling bumps underneath their raft as the tiger sharks are swimming up and ramming into them. The storm ultimately passed, and daylight broke, and they're out in this dinghy. They don't know what to do. They're surrounded by all these sharks that are literally swimming around them. They have no resources. They have nothing. They have no way to save themselves. Meg was becoming very sick from the wound in her leg, and everyone knew that probably they were going to die out here. So desperately thirsty were some of the crew members that they began leaning over and drinking seawater until they would vomit. And it was around this time, when they were drinking seawater on the 3rd day, that some of the hallucinations began. They all would see ships in the distance, and they would hear things that weren't really there. They were losing it. And it was also around this time that John, one of the crew members, said that he saw land, and he leapt out of the boat. They screamed for him to come back, but he lost his mind. and they said he only made it about a few meters away from the boat before they hear him start screaming, and the sharks swarm him and pull him under the water. Deborah would say that when this happened, they heard the scream and they all ducked down inside of the boat. Didn't say a word, didn't even react to it. They knew what was happening, and they knew what was going to happen to them. They were all going to die out here. Shortly after John had jumped in the water and been eaten by sharks, Mark stands up and says that he needs to get something at the store. He was clearly hallucinating. The other three, they tell him, "You're hallucinating, get back here, sit back down." He wasn't having it, and he stepped off the boat. Immediately, just like John, the sharks swarm him, except they pull him underneath their life raft. In fact, Deborah would say that the violence of the sharks attacking him caused their dinghy to spin. And much like when John had been attacked, they all just laid there in silence because they knew that they were all doomed. By the fourth day, everybody was on a steady decline. They didn't have any water, any food. Meg especially was outright dying. I mean, she had this horrible wound that had gone untreated. And at some point, Deborah and the other crew member who was not hurt, his name was Brad, they fell asleep, and when they woke up, Meg had passed away from her infection. They took off her jewelry and any of her valuables they could give to her family, and then they put her on the edge of the boat. They said a couple words, a little funeral for her, and then they pushed her into the water. And then they laid down inside of the raft as the sharks attacked. At this point, Deborah and Brad, the last two, they are laying in this lifeboat, fully exposed to the elements. They have no way to save themselves. And at some point they fell asleep, and they probably thought they wouldn't wake up again. But they woke up on the fifth day, and Brad looks out and thinks he sees a ship. And so he looks down and looks back up to make sure he's not hallucinating, and he still sees the ship. He looks down again and looks back up, and it's still a ship, and it's coming closer to them. And he tells Deborah, "Hey, there's a ship. I'm not imagining it. There's a ship." And she does the same thing. She kind of looks away, like, is that really a ship? And sure enough, it was. And they start waving and using all their energy to try to get this ship to see them, and the ship has clearly seen them. They're waving back. That ship would end up coming over, scooping up Deborah and Brad, getting them to a hospital, and they would make full recoveries. Deborah would go on to be an incredible motivational speaker, as you can imagine, with an experience like that, and she also wrote a book about her experience being lost at sea. Brad would actually continue to go back to sea. He was an accomplished mariner. He would end up becoming the captain of his own ship, and he would regularly sail that route that they crashed on. It's hard to imagine Harrison, Deborah, and Brad going back to a normal life, but ultimately they did. You know, they had this incredible experience. I'm sure it was incredibly traumatic, but I'm sure it gave them a new sense of purpose in the life that they were now being gifted, because they really should not have been alive. Deborah would actually say in one of her keynotes that there's never a day you feel more thankful for life than the day you almost die. If you enjoyed today's stories, I would ask you to please kindly armbar the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly 3 to 4 video uploads that sound an awful lot like what you just listened to. If you want to get in touch with me, you can message me on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen. Wherever I see you, I'm just incredibly thankful for your support. And until next time, see ya.